Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet.
Hello and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. If you listen to some of the commercials that I have that we play, we sort of cross-reference the other show that I do, which is on relationships. And the relationship podcast, I talk specifically about domestic violence, and I'm going to touch on that in this podcast as well. When we think of domestic violence, it's obviously a situation where one or both partners are in some way they're harming each other. Oftentimes we are real present to when it's physical because we can see the scars. Well, what happens, there's another component to domestic violence, which is the mental, the emotional part that happens, and it's the intimidation. It's the fear. It's the the put downs, a lot of the verbiage, and it starts there oftentimes before it ever becomes physical. Physical usually is when it just has escalated to the point where people are not communicating with each other in a healthy way at all. Something to consider when we're talking about domestic violence. Quite often, the big component in this is the dysfunction. People who have been raised in situations where domestic violence has been part of the household. Some people are sort of desensitized to it because it is almost seen as normal. It's not abnormal to hear people arguing and squabbling and throwing things and intimidating each other. That's a way of operating for some people. And without a real contrast to that, some people grow up, like I say, thinking that is normal. And what we tend to find out as we've looked backwards into the timeline of the lives of people is quite often people who are abusers have been abused themselves. So it's just something that goes on and on and on. And the thing about dysfunction is it's about getting ahead of it by gaining some knowledge and teaching people some coping skills. And much of what I talk about, especially in the relationship podcast, is about communication. And when communication breaks down, people tend to resort to a lot of what I call desperate moves to make their point. Whether it's shouting, which is obviously a big production. Some people do just the opposite. They just go silent. They do the withholding sort of thing. And that in and of itself could be a sort of a tool which people use for domestic violence. I mean, imagine it this way. The withholding part, let's say, and this happens a great deal when people who are trapped in a domestic situation, which they are very dependent upon the other person. If the person who has the power in the relationship is withholding the keys to the car or money to go shopping, any number of these kinds of things, the person who would, for lack of a better term, who is the weaker person in this scenario, they're a victim. Quite often they feel powerless to do anything about it. in some of the circumstances that create this is the abuser will try to isolate their victim so that the victim has no lifeline. They may not have friends around that they can communicate with, because the abuser sees these other individuals as people who are interfering in the operation of this. Another thing that an abuser will do is that they will convince the victim that it's the victim's fault that they are being harmed, whether it's verbally or physically. Again, this is another tactic. And, I'll introduce this because of the sex podcast, that one of the things that happens is sexual violence can be a tool that an abuser will use on their victim. And it's a very, very scary thing. And I think what happens in these situations, because of the fear, it just paralyzes people from thinking. Now, something, and this is what really captures people's imagination. It says, well, why doesn't the person just leave? Well, there are many reasons why, and a couple of which I laid out, one of which is when the abuser has isolated their victim, the victim feels powerless to leave. Physically, they can live in remote places, and where's the victim going to go? The other thing is the psychological trauma that has been played out, and the abuser tells the victim that it's the victim's fault, so the victim might try to do something to appease the abuser. The abuser also tells the victim that nobody cares about them but, the abuser. That's sort of the brainwashing thing that happens. And it's along this line in which the victim feels powerless to make any change, so they just stay in the situation. And even given the opportunity to leave sometimes, the victim feels compelled to stay because they feel that's the only safe place to be. It's a part of their conditioning, having been in this situation so long. And one of the things that's characteristic of these situations is when children grow up in this environment, they find partners as they get older, they mature, they find people who sort of fill out these same roles that they had when they were children, because that seems normal to them. And the irony is they can look around and see circumstances where that isn't the case, but that would seem like an outlier to them and not the way it is for everybody. But again, that's part of the brainwashing that happens, and it really takes quite a bit of work to help people see their own value. And they may know that the situation isn't the best, but they wonder, well, what can they really do about it? Again, they feel powerless. So if you happen to know, you the listener, if you happen to know these kinds of situations or know someone who you think is experiencing this sort of these circumstances, domestic violence, then what I would encourage you to do is to reach out to them and check on them. See if there is something that you can do. Now, I'm going to mention this number a few times. There is the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and this is a number that I looked up on the internet, and there are a number of resources there, but I'm going to mention some things in this podcast. But here is the Domestic Violence Hotline, and I will also put it in the notes in the introduction for the show when you go online and look for it. The hotline number is 1-800-799-7233. Again, National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-7233. Now, that's the National Domestic Violence Hotline. If you are in a situation in which you feel you are unsafe, this is domestic violence, give them a call, and they will be a resource for you. You can go online on the computer. There are oftentimes local agencies that are there to assist you if you have a situation that is domestic and there's some violence going on, and you can also get the authorities, get the local authorities, get the police involved. If they see any signs of domestic violence that has happened, then they are mandated to make an arrest. That is to intercede in your behalf and on behalf of the victim. So whether it is adults or children or anything of that sort, again, don't stay silent. These people need help. Oftentimes they don't know where to turn, or they are so afraid to do anything. They need help. So I'm going to take a break right now, and I'll come back and I'm going to talk about this some more. Stay tuned.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Hello and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and I am talking about domestic violence. And something to be mindful of is it is not just limited to, men overpowering women. Something that gets mentioned from time to time. I mean, we see it more so in the newspapers because it always seems like one of those odd things where men are victims of domestic abuse when being perpetrated by a woman. It's not uncommon at all. The other thing is when you have domestic partners who are same sex. Again, either of the genders, men or women, can be victims of domestic abuse. So reaching out and helping these individuals is critically important. Now, why would it be that men would not speak about their situation? Well, it has a lot to do with the way men are conditioned. Men are conditioned that complaining about something such as this is not very manly. And to say something is going to be humiliating to you, and you don't want that. Because if you're a man, then you shouldn't really be complaining about something like this. Also, that's part of the brainwashing from the abuser to the victim about how this works. Again, men are conditioned to behave certain ways, especially when it comes to abuse. A lot of this really starts with how do you feel? And that's a very important indicator of, is this an abuse situation or is it not? For example, if you feel like you're being demeaned, that what you value isn't being acknowledged or supported, if you feel harassed, threatened, or intimidated. See, these are things that we feel. Now, this is this is not the threshold where you're being physically attacked, but you certainly feel afraid, feel threatened. And the significance of this is the abuser will oftentimes try to convince the victim that what they feel isn't accurate. Or in the case of some situations, yeah, you may feel that way, but it's your fault. You're the one that caused me, that is the abuser, to want to scare you, to intimidate you, to do all of these things towards you. Again, that's part of the conditioning. And when you're a man, feeling afraid is not very manly. So to report something like that would, as I said in the beginning, it would make you feel humiliated. No one's going to believe you, and so forth. So I wanted to dispel that myth. The idea that if you're a man, that domestic violence doesn't happen to you, that is totally incorrect. It doesn't matter how big or small the person is, young, old, it happens. And you should report it. It takes a lot of courage for anybody who's in a situation like that to want to step out of it. Not that stepping out is something that's a person wouldn't want to do, but it takes courage, because when you think about all the brainwashing that goes on in this, and I've said that many, many times, if you can think of situations in which people have been convinced that everything is okay, this is the way it's supposed to be, this is normal, and so many abuse situations have that component. Somebody has validated, incorrectly, but somebody has validated that this abuse is normal. This is what it's supposed to be like. You were supposed to be treated this way because you did something bad, and you're being punished as a response so that you don't do whatever it is you did. See, abusers are very good at manipulating the facts and twisting the story and convincing people of what the truth is not. So just to kind of summarize some of the things that a victim will feel is that they may be afraid of their partner much of the time, and they will avoid certain topics out of fear that when they mention it, that the abuser is going to become enraged. And as I mentioned, they will convince you that the reason you are being mistreated or hurt is because you deserve it. Now, how crazy is that? And as an aside, they will convince you that you're the crazy one, being the victim, that you're the one who doesn't understand what's really going on. And you may wind up feeling emotionally numb or helpless. Maybe they humiliate you or yell, they criticize or put you down. And quite often, another situation is they will embarrass you in front of your family or friends. And from time to time, those individuals may point out, hey, that's not right, what your partner said to you. And like I say, this can happen both ways. Men or women can be the abuser. So it's not gender specific. Being ignored, being put down, especially your accomplishments. Abusers tend to do that because they want to keep you in your box, because as you feel a sense of pride and you swell with that pride and have some independence, then the abuser feels like you are abandoning them. So then they tend to ratchet up the stakes in order to get you back into control. And abusers will see you as an object, a sex object, or feel like they own you. And they treat you that way rather than as a person. I took some notes and wanted to point some of those things out. You can go online and find a number of resources. Number one, information about domestic violence itself, agencies that can help if you feel like you are the victim of this circumstance. There is law enforcement who will be of assistance to you. And I did mention the domestic violence hotline, which, again, 1-800-799-7233. Call them if you feel like you are a victim of domestic violence, and if you are the friend of someone and you want some help, you want to talk to somebody. This is another way in which you can be an advocate for someone. I'm going to take a break, and I'll be right back after this.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and I'm talking about domestic violence in this particular episode. Something to be mindful of is if these are some of the traits that abusers perpetrate on their victims. They destroy your belongings, force you to have sex, threaten to commit suicide if you leave. Now imagine an abuser doing something like that to their victim, threatening self-harm if you leave. That's some of the psychological stuff that happens that, you don't see scars for that, but what you get a sense of is the manipulation. And another thing, they'll threaten to take your children away or harm them if you leave. They'll hurt you, threaten to hurt or kill you. They have a bad or unpredictable temper. They, act jealous. If they keep you from seeing your friends or family. Now, that's a big one because it's the isolation is what makes a victim feel even more victimized, if you can even think of it that way, because they cut off all your lifelines. Because part of what helps you see that there's something wrong is when you have contrast. But if you don't have access to some of the contrasts in these situations, then you begin to operate inside of this. Not only do you have the fear, but you feel more helpless because you don't have a way of feeling like you can get outside of these situations. And like I said, if you're in a relationship and you have children, you have things that really tie you to this person, and this person is making terroristic type threats on all of those things you value, because obviously they know something about you, so they know just where to hurt you the most. See, that's what's dangerous about these situations. So if you know someone who is going through a situation like this, then reach out to them. Now, do it in a way that doesn't bring attention to the situation, because you want to try to find a way to help this person, give them resources, talk to them if you can. And when I say don't make a big deal about it, I mean that from the standpoint of not exposing them to where their abuser may get notice of this. You want to help them. And if the abuser is aware of what's going on, sometimes that may make them escalate. So you can always tell the authorities, allow them to step in the situation, because they have a lot of resources, a lot of tools themselves. I mean, the police or something like that. And again, I gave the domestic violence hotline. It'd been 1-800-799-7233. That's a resource. You can go online, type in domestic violence in the header, and see what pops up for you, and offer that as a resource. Offer yourself as a lifeline, because oftentimes that's where some of the change begins for these individuals, because they feel that they have someone to share the burden of what's really scaring them. And if you can get them to talk, that's great. because at least it'll help ease some of the anxiety and begin to help plant the seeds on what they can do about their situation. Now, I've talked a lot about this from the standpoint of if you're an outsider sort of looking in. And if you are going through this situation, I've left that number a few times about the domestic violence hotline. That is a resource for you. But I'm going to talk to those individuals who are going through it about what they are feeling as it is happening. Yes, there is a great deal of fear because you're afraid that they're going to harm you. And other times it's not just the physical threats, but as I said, it's the intimidation and or the exposure of maybe personal things that have happened to you, things that would be very humiliating, and they threaten to tell people about this. See, that's another way in which they immobilize you. And why people do this sort of thing, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, some people have experienced their own trauma and they've never resolved it. They've basically have grown up with it. They've stuffed it. And now when they get older and they get into a relationship, these things they come out. They come out later down the road, which is why it's very important to identify this sort of stuff and begin to deal with it in a way that's healthy. And it's why when you start seeing some of these early signs of the domestic violence, then the sooner you can separate yourself from that person, the chances are the safer that you'll be, and the less chance of being a victim in these situations. It's hard to predict because people who are abusers will tell you, well, this is the only time it's happened. And they can be very convincing. Say, oh, I'm sorry, it'll never happen again. And it's part of the circle or the cycle of violence. It may have been 2 or 3 years ago that something happened, an episode, some catalyst, some situation in their life that they exploded, and then they went enraged and took it out on you, and they apologize. And then sometime later, there's a repeat. Some incident happens that's a catalyst for their rage, and they take it out on you. See, that's something that person needs to deal with. And you don't want to leave yourself exposed to their rants, their taunts, their rages. That's a very scary thing to experience. But going back to what a person who is in this situation is experiencing, and yes, you're afraid, and it can be very difficult to reach out, man or woman. You know, the circumstance that men tend to feel is there may be a great deal of shame around something and having been threatened that all of your dirt will come out if you don't stay silent. Like I said, it happens on both sides. But men especially, in the circumstance that men are coached to believe, because when we're talking about feelings, and men are conditioned oftentimes to stuff their feelings, it makes them feel as if they have no voice. They have no reason to say anything. See, the physical scars are much easier to see on a person. The emotional, the mental scars are so much harder to see initially. But if we watch behavior, then the emotional scars can be, they can be identified. And that's what therapists and counselors and people who deal with these kinds of things are very able to see, because there are patterns to these sorts of things. Now, I want to mention, I haven't talked about child abuse in this particular podcast because I don't imagine that children are actually going to be listening to this program. So it is not an omission because of a lack of thought about that subject, but that is a different subject that would be covered in probably a different forum. But clearly, abused children oftentimes grow up to be abusers themselves. And I talked about the patterns that are usually laid out and how it escalates and becomes very much a part of someone's behavior. And it's about recognizing those things and doing something about them. And we would hope that we get ahead of it before people get hurt and all the damage that happens because people are behaving that way. Just to know that domestic violence is no joke. It does a lot of harm, a lot of damage to people in society, and that's why I want to share that there are lots of resources out there to deal with it. And hopefully, if this is a situation that you are in, that you have the courage to step out of it, to reach out, to find help. And there is help out there. It may take a little work to find it, but make that something that's as important as anything else that you do, because you deserve to be loved and cared about. And on that note, I want to thank you for listening to the podcast, and I hope that has been helpful. Share it with your friends. Make it a point to check on your friends. Tell them that you care about them. And if you find anything is wrong with them in terms of domestic violence, reach out and make a difference for their lives. I'm John Johnson. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From sex and relationships to health and wellness, life and happiness, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast.